Welcome to All Things Design, the podcast where I talk to design leaders about how design drives digital transformation.
What do you get when you meld art, technology, and design? Well, you get UX, you get product design. I think healthy and mature design teams are fairly comfortable providing critique.
I'm Joe Woodham, the founder of Tory Consulting, Australia's leading design consultancy. We help big brands by embedding amazing designers in their teams. Our designers create experiences that millions of people use. In today's episode, I'm speaking with James Ratsasane, former global experience design leader from Aēsop, where we unpack a few key topics. The art of strategic alignment. A strong, simple vision helps everyone, designers, product managers, and leaders stay on the same page. Now, remember, if you like today's episode, please make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss insights from the industry's top design leaders. James, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, Joe. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolute pleasure. Now, let's start with an opening question. What made you become a designer?
Curiosity, I think, is probably the thing that drove me to this point. Yeah, just a curiosity in terms of solving problems and making things and trying to arrange things in a more aesthetic, enjoyable way.
Interesting. So when you were going through school, was that the career path, or was it like an evolution of finding it and then realizing that that was the passion?
In all honesty, I stumbled into what we call digital product design, service design. But when I was, say, in high school, I was really interested in art. And I actually started, my first degree was fine art. I studied at the Victorian College of the Arts. And I suppose what drove me to art was that curiosity of how one can interrogate the world, I would say, or communicate ideas, interrogate ideas. And it was also just this being young was just this noble thing to do. But I soon found that I was a little bit maybe dissatisfied with, I remember when I finished the course and I'd sort of done some travel and so forth, I was dissatisfied with my own work, my own art. And what I was really drawn to was really the ideas that for some reason I couldn't express well in my own art. So I went and studied philosophy after that at the University of Melbourne. And so then all of a sudden I was just dealing with ideas. But that was probably the first really critical skill that I developed that's helping me today, and that's the skill of critical thinking, of being able to take a premise and the conclusion, validating it with logic, that kind of thing. But of course, neither of those two things were very conducive to, I suppose, being financially comfortable. I spent many years kind of going back and forth between art, and then it was a point where somebody invited me to do some illustrations for a wine label. And it was a wine label for a wine range called Cumulus. And I did a few watercolors. And that was probably my first foray into creating something commercially. And that was a really nice, experience. And it was a really good feeling of being paid for your taking a brief and a business problem and creating something which could solve that business problem. But I didn't at that point say to myself, I'll start doing designing or illustrating at that point. And I still kind of focused a lot on art, and at the time also a lot on music. But at some point it was probably towards the late noughties where I was working as a advertising artist. It was predominantly print design, where I revived an interest in visual communication. And so I went back and studied and did like a grad dip in graphic design, and more I became interested in taking on more freelance projects that way. And towards, it was around 2010, 2011, I was reading something online around coding HTML and CSS. And I don't know what brought me to that point. I think it was because I needed to create a website for myself, for my folio. And I started fooling around with coding, and that really got me excited about digital. And bit by bit, I started taking on creating websites for people and teaching myself to code. And at the time, I obviously had no idea what UX was, but it all just kind of came about. And I remember thinking to myself early at that point, what do you get when you meld art, technology, and design? Well, you get UX, you get product design. So that kind of thinking, seemed to really be a natural progression for me.
Okay. It's a pretty good segue into, I guess, a topic, how you have maybe built the knowledge base around executing on a product design or strategy. Obviously, it's a very important part of the process is really understanding the vision and strategy of the company that you work for, and then being able to work with product teams to execute that. Can you maybe start with an introduction and talk me through the process that you've got?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really critical question, important question, Joe. And I think you nailed it on the head when you said vision. I think when in the beginning with a lot of product teams, particularly around prioritization time and, quarterly planning and just thinking about their roadmaps, and some will do quarters, some will do 6 months, and sometimes you'll see 2 to 3 year roadmaps, even 5 year roadmaps. I don't really want to get into a debate on how far out companies should go or teams should go, but what I found is that inevitably, in order to figure out if you're building the right thing or if you're directionally in the right place, and this might be controversial, but you do need a little bit of a vision also. Knowing what your customers want and knowing what the business ambition is kind of par for the course, in my view. There should be a healthy amount of customer understanding before we go into that prioritization piece. And of course, the business ambition, whatever that is, to me is not really a strategy. Getting bigger and better and making more money is not really the strategy. But in order to
Ambition, but
yeah, I mean, it's kind of a truism, but I would say the vision, that North Star, is what is the glue that binds the cross-functional team together. It's a thing that they get up every day for, in terms of really believing in the mission and the vision. But also, often I see teams where they're working on discrete, whether it's upper funnel, lower funnel, or mission-based, which is what outcomes-based kind of work. They're working on a discrete sort of problem, and for people like myself, who you'll typically sort of oversee a lot of designers in different product teams, having a vision that's aligned on at the executive level is really helpful. And that vision isn't really, it's not a marketing thing. It should be something that inspires, it's aspiration. It's something that there's no answer to how you would execute it, but it's something that says something about how you will differentiate yourself from your competitors. And that differentiation is the key ingredient to strategy, I would say. Strategy, at the end of the day, is where are we going to play and how are we going to win, to quote Roger Martin. And I think that's a really nice way to think of it, because often, particularly I see a lot of ICs, whether they're in engineering, product, or design, and they might be given this big strategy deck. It's 100 pages and it's just like overwhelming, but no one can walk away and articulate the strategy in a single sentence or two. And I think that's a big problem. I think as leaders, whether you're in product engineering, design, or you might be a CDO or chief customer officer or whatnot, everybody in the company should be able to articulate the strategy in 2 to 3 sentences.
I agree. You're obviously Aēsop right now. They're a luxury brand, so they've clearly got a very good vision of what they want to be. How easy is it for you to sit with the stakeholders and understand exactly what they're trying to, from the vision, drive into sort of a strategic direction and translate that back to the team so everyone can clearly understand what that looks like? Because you're right, a 100-page document isn't going to serve anyone well, but something that you can clearly articulate in one sentence is going to be easier for everyone to get on board. So how do you make sure that everyone can get aligned on that?
I simply just put the UX into it. So I suppose what I mean by that is, as designers, we spend a lot of time designing for end users, for our customers. But what I see a lot of, I suppose, people forget is that, our stakeholders might be our users too sometimes. I simply try to make my interactions and conversations, artifacts, I should say. And this is what I encourage with my team also. Now, how do you put the UX into your artifacts so that when somebody's using it, and that might be a journey map, it might be a pitch deck, it might even be a prototype, they don't have to think too hard. It's a one-liner, and what are the key takeaways? And they have a better chance of remembering it if you keep it very concise and focused in that way. And that's a superpower, I think a lot of designers can inject tomorrow if they really wanted to. And they'll start to see some really great results, I think.
You're talking about, I guess, treating your stakeholders like users as well. Like, do you use different communication styles for both sides of that picture? So when you are
Yeah.
presenting to stakeholders, it's in their language, it's in their communication style as opposed to users, which obviously you're going to have to speak differently.
I've never met a stakeholder or a decision maker that had a lot of time.
Cool.
Yeah. In my interactions, I often try to respect that time and design whatever it is that's being presented in a way that, okay, wow, they can get it in 3 to 5 seconds. Maybe if you need to explain it, you can explain it comfortably in 15, 20 seconds, that kind of thing. And look, that took a long time. It's actually really hard to do that, though. That's the irony. It's absolutely really hard. It actually means you really need to know your subject matter, or you really means you need to know your material. It's probably less to do with vocabulary and communication style, but more to do with the substance of what it is that is being presented. And I know that some people will espouse that, use these words or don't use these words and speak with authority or this or that. I've always been quietly spoken in big presentations or even in meetings where we make decisions, just in terms of, sure, maybe there's a subconscious thing when you use certain words. I just think smart people see through that. The kernel of the idea needs to be good.
I agree. And I align with everything you said. Like, yeah, people in more executive positions or leadership positions tend to have less time. So I think as you move up the ranks, so into design leadership, you've got to be able to communicate effectively to them because it is a large portion of the job. So being able to step away from maybe like design talk and speak in their language to make sure that they get what you're talking about and they get it quickly and you don't have to re-explain it. And I think a lot of the time it's talking with confidence, right? You don't need, doesn't matter if you're softly spoken or if you're loud. If you're speaking with confidence, it betrays a level of clarity and understanding. So that's what people want.
It all comes down to just doing the work. People that really have done the work, they've thought through the angles, they've thought through the pros and cons, they've done the trade-off decisions. They can really speak with confidence because they know what it is that they're proposing, or what the ask is and what the impact of the ask is. And even if they don't, they'll have at least a 70% degree of confidence. We typically don't try to push for something, or unless we have at least 70% confidence. Yeah. And just to your point around, for someone like yourself, you're probably online all day. Maybe it might be LinkedIn or your newsfeed or whatnot. There's snippets of content that actually are memorable, the ones that have a hook. That first line, maybe it's an image or something that captures your attention.
It's an art form.
Yeah. And I mean, you can imagine what stakeholder and executives' calendar might be like, the amount of information that's going in and out. On top of that, there's probably a little bit of side action internet usage going on too. So whatever it is that you're doing also needs to resonate within that, all the noise. Yeah.
I want to stick on this point because I think it's a fascinating topic. You said it took you a while to, I guess, learn and develop those skills. Like, what were some of the things that you focused on to really bring out this skill? Because I think it's a very important skill. And as design progresses, I think it's becoming more and more important to have that communication skill honed in. So what are some of the things that you worked through yourself?
I probably read it somewhere along the lines many years ago, but when it sort of hit home for me was probably several years ago, where I was reading up on remembering things, because I was sort of at a point in my career where I was quite decision fatigued. A lot of things were going in and finding myself having to write notes to remember stuff. And I thought to myself, if I can get better at memorizing stuff, then I wouldn't have to have all these notes and create elaborate organization systems. And although I do have an elaborate organization system, and I stumbled onto this exercise where you'd read, say, a paragraph, and then you would try to summarize it in one sentence. And then you go to the next paragraph and you try to summarize that in one sentence, but now you've got two sentences. And then what you do is you try to summarize those two sentences down to one. You're basically reading through the page and consolidating it always down to this one sentence. And I tried it one day, and it was actually really fun. It was hard, very, very hard. and super fun. But what I noticed immediately was that the next day I could succinctly recall and all the ideas, because I had to do the hard work of thinking through all of these ideas and seeing what was worth keeping, what wasn't worth keeping. And at that point, I sort of realized, I started doing it more and more. And I realized to myself, geez, if you do a good job of summarizing the idea, it is a hell of a lot easier to remember. Let me try that in presentations. Let me try that in conversation. Obviously, you have to do the work to figure out what's worth keeping and what's not, and the best way to articulate it. But yeah, it was by accident, to answer your question, Joe. Purely by accident. It was me trying to solve a personal problem that I was dealing with around memorizing things, and then stumbling onto this mnemonic device, mnemonic technique of comprehension that seemed to be really effective. And I'm not saying that it's a silver bullet, but I guess what I am saying is that, yeah, there's an efficiency and there's a clarity around doing something like that that I think your users or your stakeholders, your collaborators will really welcome.
If you've been able to like synthesize down a page worth of notes into one sentence, it's a lot easier to communicate that one sentence to a broader audience, right?
Absolutely.
You wouldn't expect the audience to remember that entire one-page document, but if you synthesize it down to one line, it's probably way more likely, right? So
yeah, I mean, another useful technique, and everyone will know what mind maps are or tree maps are, and it's another way you can do it. You know, particularly going back to product design, there's something that I really find useful is the opportunity tree. And that's another way of synthesizing down to a single idea, or taking that single idea and extrapolating it out. But I suppose in the context of the opportunity idea, that idea is usually some kind of OKR, or it's an outcome that the team are striving for.
all right, let's move it along. So like we've talked about, I guess, the vision and then the communication piece being very important, and we're probably more focused on stakeholders, probably from a senior level. Like when it comes to like maybe dealing with product teams, so product managers or product owners, and then the technical side, so the developers. Like, how do you ensure that in your product teams everyone's aligned with that vision, and your designers are able to communicate at the right level? So maybe push back on product owners or communicate the designs effectively with the development team. Like it's different communication style, right? How do you manage that?
I want to say something that probably is more true most of the time, and that's that most of the time people aren't aligned, and it requires a bit of work to get aligned. But where I've seen great alignment happen is when collaboration is really high. The alignment where teams get together at the very beginning and work through maybe a strategy canvas or a lean product canvas together. And I truly mean that. So it's not this thing where the team get together and all the tickets are made up already, ready to go. It's not like that. Or it's like, okay, here's the challenge, and that challenge should be fairly nondescript in terms of the solution. And this is the test of maturity, I suppose. And product teams that understand the difference between a challenge or OKR and a feature, because sometimes there are features masquerading as OKR. And so the sign of a high autonomous and a mature product team is that the OKR is actually it's inspirational, it's aspirational, and the key result is somewhat tied back to user value. It's a change in behavior that we're looking at, rather than we increase sign-ups by X%. That is a change in behavior, but there's some kind of implicit value for the customer, and it's apparent. But you can see in that instance, you don't have a solution or a feature, because there are an infinite numbers of ways you could solve for any given OKR. But the teams that get together really early on and work through that, maybe not the OKR, but at least the strategy piece around, okay, what is the business problem? What are our obstacles? Where are we going to play? How are we going to win? And then taking those inputs onto a lean product canvas. And when I say lean product canvas, it's actually what we used to call back in the day the UX lean canvas. But since then, I believe it's been renamed to the lean product canvas, which is probably my favorite framework because it's so simple. It's a one pager and you don't need to go off and design an elaborate workshop. You can just get together and start working. So I highly recommend people check it out. It's created by a guy called Josh Snyder and Jeff Godhealth, I believe is how you pronounce his name. I encourage all the guys to use it all the time, and the guys typically will start any project with the lean canvas. And the team gets together, so product engineering, design, they all get together and they get everything out onto this one page. It's everything from the business problems to the jobs to be done, the things that their customers are trying to do, and what does good look like? What are some of the risky assumptions? And most importantly, what are the things that we need to learn first in order to progress this piece of work? So from the very beginning, everybody is on the same playing field and everybody's contributing and everybody has skin in the game. So those teams that do that achieve this nirvana state of alignment. The challenge, I think, for a lot of teams is to continue that momentum because in the beginning it's always fun. There's optimism. And that's the way you should approach any new project, with optimism. Inevitably, as teams progress through, maintaining that momentum is critical. And often the momentum will die if teams have tried to maybe do something that's maybe a little bit too ambitious for that quarter, or maybe it's a little bit too heavy in terms of design and engineering. It's not to say that you don't try to build something that's great, but often in the beginning, sometimes more fruitful to just be able to validate your idea.
You're not always going to find an OKR that you can solve in a quarter, right? Sometimes they move into the next quarter. How do you keep alignment within the team? Like, let's say if things don't go as smoothly as you'd hoped as a team, how do you ensure that the alignment stays? So like you can kind of keep coming back to that initial nirvana you mentioned and the project stays on track.
We have a fairly simple cadence where a meeting called Design Studio, and it's effectively the meeting where we do our internal crits. So we do that twice a week, and that's where all the designers come back together and share work and support each other. And it's really for the benefit of the team. And it goes back to this culture of critique also, I think healthy and mature design teams are fairly comfortable providing critique. And again, there's ways to do it and ways not to do it. And obviously, we prefer designers who are comfortable showing early work, mid work, and late work. I think it's the same for most organizations where they don't really want designers going off for a month or two and not showing anything and doing a big grand reveal. We do that, and at least at that level, design is aligned. And look, there'll always be times where maybe there's something that I wouldn't have done, or maybe another designer wouldn't have done it that way. But what matters most is that the team are aligned on making a decision to move forward. Again, that is something that I think there's a misconception. To me, alignment doesn't necessarily have to be that everybody agrees that this is the way forward, because you're just half the time not going to have that, because there's a lot of competing interests, let's just say. If you can get to 70% of the team saying, yep, this is the way, even 90%, fantastic. But the reason why I say that is because if you're always striving for everybody to agree, yes, this is the way forward, then you kind of end up in this murky land of design by committee, death by 1,000 cuts. And I think what matters is that the team is directionally aligned. Like, this is the general direction. We're all aligned on that. Great, fantastic. In terms of the actual discrete execution or how we do it, everyone's aligned, fantastic. But if not, what matters is that the team make a decision that, okay, we all align enough to agree that we'll move forward, and we'll monitor this. This is what I like to call a tripwire, because at that point, you should have your metrics. You should have a good understanding of how you'll measure success. And it's very easy to be able to go back after a million sessions once the thing's been released and be able to validate whether or not it's trending in the right direction in terms of what we expect to see from this work. And I often say to my team, at least, you can always invoke a tripwire where, if you don't agree, you agree that we'll see how it goes and we'll test it, experiments, because there's nothing worse than something not going out. It's in this limbo of decision making for like months and months, and that's the single worst thing you can do. And that's the case for many teams. And ultimately, most of the time someone will come in, whether it's myself or the PM or whoever and do the tiebreaker. But I try to avoid that. I prefer people to solve their own problems within their own teams. Happy to share what I think, but yeah, there's been plenty of things where I might not have approached it that way, but I've aligned in supporting it and aligned enough to see, okay, let's see what happens. Maybe I'll learn something new. So, I think as a designer, you also need to have those moments and of curiosity, going back to that notion of curiosity.
Definitely. And you can become the bottleneck if you're stopping things going, hey, I might do this differently. Then people will start checking in to ensure that they pass the James test before they try and release something. So getting people to make their own decisions makes things smoother. But you're right. You don't know everything. Someone else might.
If something's really like, whoa, this is almost a different experience to the rest of the platform or the site, then sometimes we do have to, rein it back in. Let's just say. But yeah, I mean, just going back to your very first question, having a good cadence, kind of systems and processes is part of the strategy too. That's how teams, mobilize and build great stuff.
How frequently would you check back with like C-level just to make sure that you're still on track with their vision and still enacting their strategy?
In truth, all the time. And look, maybe the designers themselves might not be doing that, but I certainly try to cascade upwards where things are at or headed, because I'm going to make a distinction here. It's less about permission. Do we have permission to keep going in this trajectory or not? And it's more about eliciting feedback. It's more about sense checking and stress testing your own thinking. And that's why I like to cascade things upwards, both upwards and diversely. And I don't know and this is probably something that I would say is a really kind of big difference between good designers and bad designers. So a good designer is actually wanting to break their own design, And what I mean by that is they're wanting to show it, whether it's to customers, to stakeholders, or to C-suite, in order to stress test their own thinking. Where some designers might struggle is, for whatever reason, can't separate what people say about the work from their own feelings about the work or their own sort of sense of achievement. So what I mean by that is everybody who who's a professional designer that's at one point probably very passionate, and they probably still are very passionate. I know I'm very passionate about work, and sometimes when people say things about the work which said in a way that is not good feedback, it can hurt, it can sting, it can feel demoralizing. And so maybe some designers are afraid of that, and it's hard to tie that reaction or the emotional abrasiveness of getting bad feedback. But I think good designers, they'll still maybe feel that when somebody says something, but the desire, the motivation to arrive at the best solution and to do that through the lens of eliciting feedback is more of a driver than not showing the work. And they're the ones that I think, even if they realize it's the wrong direction, will benefit the most, because you'd rather get rid of bad ideas quickly than get to the point where, I don't know, a team spent too much, 2 quarters and X amount of dollars on something that was maybe not the right solution. Look, it's one observation, and I would just say that one thing, I suppose for me, the thing that started to make things a lot more impactful from my own practice was when I realized that every time we show work, it's an opportunity to make the work better. And that was a really exciting proposition. And I would just really encourage all the designers out there listening to this and who may feel a little bit apprehensive about showing work, especially to C-suite, that don't be, because the work is not tied to who you are as a designer. It's a really great opportunity to A, build rapport, and B, make the work even better.
I actually really like that. Like, I agree with you. I think a good designer is a designer that can communicate, and they have to be able to communicate what they're doing and be open to feedback. Like, the only way to learn is through feedback, right? So if you go off and think you've got the best idea, or you just don't want to get any negative feedback and you spend way too long building something that becomes irrelevant, who's that serving? No one in the end. Your design doesn't end up seeing the light of day.
I think it's human nature, and I see it a lot, whether you're in product engineering, design, and there's this human nature thing where we the bit that we love doing is the ideation, and we start to fall in love with solutions. And I would just say, in the beginning, you might have 12, 20, 24, 50 ideas, but how do you know which ones are the good ones or the bad ones? You don't. You just don't. You have a good feeling. But look, yeah, I mean, it could also open up a can of worms, and I've seen a lot of debates around, are we ceding control, or are we throwing too much work and so forth? And I'd say do it, but do it in a way where you're not ceding too much. You're still the designer, and your job is to come up with solutions.
I agree. How do you manage that? Let's say you've got a designer on your team and you kind of can see that's maybe the path that they're taking in some of the work that they're doing. Like, how do you sit with them and communicate with them to make sure that they kind of are able to open up and grow that confidence to be able to, I guess, get feedback on things or get rejection?
Well, I think firstly, they get a lot of practice in design crits. Obviously, the level of psychological safety is a lot higher amongst designers in their own team in design crits. Maybe it's in terms of the hiring decisions, but we tend to hire designers who you can tell that they're open to feedback. And then you obviously nurture that, and you try to find platforms on which people can present to a wider audience and so forth. But at Aēsop, I mean, it is a culture of presentations. Like, people do present quite a bit. Obviously, whether it's sprint review or elevation sessions internally and so forth. But I would just encourage every designer that, hey, going back to our earlier conversation around distilling things into single ideas, if you can do that, then you'll find yourself in a situation where you just want to keep presenting. You're really proud of the effort you put in, and you want to present the work. It's a really good litmus test. How do you know if a design has maybe seeded too much, or this thing has become a bit like design by committee? And you simply ask, well, are you proud of it? If they say no, well, okay.
Very good point. James, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. I've learned so much, and I think it's probably more in a deep dive on the psychology behind designers and helping them on that journey. So really appreciate it. If anyone wants to reach out and connect with you directly, best way just to connect via LinkedIn?
Yeah.
Beautiful. James, once again, it was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Joe.